All right, I'm going to get us going here. We have a lot to cover this evening, miles to go before we sleep. And so, welcome to this course, Christian Theologies of Power and Resistance. This course is being put together by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. We're an interfaith nonprofit that works with communities of Christians and Jews and Muslims and really everyone else to try to build pluralism and bring people together here in challenging and dark times. So my name is Matt Taylor. I'm one of the scholars at ICJS. I work on Christian nationalism and Christian extremism and also on Islam in America. So as we get going, we're going to try as much as possible to use technology. As I'm sure you all know, technology can be both a blessing and a curse. So I am dropping a link in the chat here, if I can figure out how to do that. And there we go. So if you click on that link, or if you scan the QR code on the screen with your phone, or if you just go to slido.com and enter that code, that will get you into the interactive portion of our course. That will allow you to participate in the Q&A and put questions in there, or upvote questions if you think there's a good question that you wish you had asked and you want to make sure it gets answered. It's also where we're going to do some interactive features. So you don't have to be in there, but it will really help us if you can sign into that and take a minute to do that. It should be a fairly simple interface. You don't have to download the app or anything. You can just open a browser on your phone or open another window in your browser and have that ready. So as we get started, I want to orient us a little bit with the moment that we are in, the challenging moment that we are in with regards to Christianity and power. So this week, for those who might be watching this online after the fact, it is Wednesday, January 22nd, 2 days after Trump's second inauguration. So we just inaugurated, for the second time, Donald Trump, an authoritarian who has promised vengeance on the quote-unquote enemy within. He was elected both times, overwhelmingly on Christian support. In fact, if white Christians had not backed Donald Trump, he would not have been elected either time. And they backed him quite vociferously. He said in his inauguration address on Monday that, quote unquote, my life was saved for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again. So he is invoking theology as a rationale for the authoritarian regime that he is bringing to bear in the United States. Donald Trump has influential Christian advisors who surround him. I wrote an entire book about Donald Trump's Christian advisors and many of the Christian theologians who have bolstered his cause. And even in some of his own cabinet nominees who are carrying extreme theologies of Christian supremacy, of anti-Semitism, and of anti-Muslim hatred. Sometimes we call that Islamophobia, but I don't think these folks are afraid of Muslims. They just hate Muslims. And the same theologies that are being used by some of Trump's advisors and his supporters, some of which we will look at in this course, especially in our third session, are currently bolstering this quasi-messianic fervor around Trump and radicalizing millions of American Christians with visions of creating, or as they might put it, restoring a United States where there is no separation of church and state, and where all non-Christians are de facto second-class citizens. And if you recall 8 years ago, in early 2017, progressive and liberal and centrist Christians, as well as people across the ideological and political spectrum and of all kinds of different religious faiths, mobilized to resist Donald Trump and his policy agenda. And I'm pretty dialed into these conversations. I run in these circles, and I don't hear any similar mobilization going on. Where is the Christian resistance to this? So that is some of what I want to engage in our 3 sessions together. But first, we're going to do a little participation event. So if you are just signing in, we dropped a link in the chat, and I can try to put it in there again. Let me pull up the chat one more time here. And so go ahead and click on that. I'm having trouble with the chat. Maybe somebody else can throw the link in there if somebody has access to it. So we are going to do a couple live word clouds here. So if you can sign into Slido, and I'm going to switch over our slideshow, but here's the two questions we're going to engage. First, I'm going to have you answer and try to do this in as much as possible, one word. What are the most beautiful things about Christianity in your view? And you can put multiple answers, but try to do one word because it's going to be like a word cloud. And then we'll do that first, and then we're going to do what are the ugliest things about Christianity in your view. Okay, so let me switch over. Go ahead and move into the Slido, and these will pop up on the screen as people are putting them in here. All right. So what I am seeing is love is getting a lot of votes. The larger the word is, the more times somebody has entered that. Forgiveness is pretty big in there. Patience, compassion, justice, grace, hope, mercy, humility. These are all things I love about Christianity as well. These are all beautiful things in my view. Jesus, peace, love and forgiveness, restoration, community, generosity, the fruit of the spirit, liberation, theology. You guys are preaching my language. Okay, now we're going to do the next one. So we've got what's the most beautiful thing. So now this should come up as another option in Slido. What are the ugliest things about Christianity in your view? And again, try to keep it to one word if you can, but you're welcome to put multiple entries. What I am seeing is, in many ways, the mirror image of what we just saw in terms of the beauty. That here we have intolerance, judgment in both the British and the American spelling, supremacy, superiority, racism, hate, self righteousness, judgment, hatred, hypocrisy, bigotry, wrath, arrogance, power, dominance, conversion, abuse, righteousness, supersessionism, superiority. So I think that's a pretty representative sample that we just got there of both the beauties and the challenges that we are facing within Christianity today. And I think in many ways you could do the same thing with any religious tradition, right? There are beautiful and ugly things in all of our traditions and all of our human communities and experiences. The question I really want to grapple with in this course is how can we hold together Christianity's beauty and its aggressions and abuses? And think about those at the same time. Not think about those as completely separate categories, but think about those as both a part of the Christian tradition and the Christian experience. And how do we live with that tension between those beautiful things that we are very attractive and very compelling, but then those very dark and negative things that have also been a real part of Christian history and Christian experience. Now, there are two popular options, I would say, for how people have tried to hold those things together. We're going to reject both of these. At least I'm going to reject both of these popular options. The first popular option is to say that Christianity itself is abusive and problematic and intrinsically abusive. So we just need to get rid of it. And sometimes people will even extend this out to say that religion in general is the problem. All religion is this way, and we just need to get rid of religion. Well, let me give a couple rejoinders to that. A, Christianity contains approximately 2.4 billion people today. And that's right now either holding steady or growing in terms of absolute numbers. Christianity's not going anywhere, right? It's it's here to stay for the foreseeable future. So the idea that we're just going to get rid of it is not really an option that's on the table in my view. Second, these abuses and harms are issues in basically every global religious tradition. And you might say, well, that's all the more reason to get rid of religion. Fine, but 86% of humanity identifies with a religious tradition. So while we are an increasingly secular culture here and in parts of Europe and other parts of the developed world, the global trend is more towards religion than towards secularism. And so to say, well, we just need to get rid of religion, well, that's also not happening anytime soon. And then I would also just say for people who might endorse this idea, let's just get rid of Christianity, well, you're also not accounting for those beautiful things. You're not accounting for that list of wonderful things that we just generated about Christianity. So I don't think that this is a sufficient response to to holding together the beauties and the challenges of Christianity. The second popular option, and this is often put forward by Christians themselves, is to say that the abusers and the militant Christians are not real Christians. They just use Christianity for other ends. And the real Christians are the ones who inhabit that first set of virtues, and that anyone who's participating in any of those negative things must not be a real Christian. Well, I don't think that that's a sufficient answer either. So just on a basic sociological level, what we call Christian, well, if it walks like a duck and swims like a duck and quacks like a duck and says the creeds like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? And Christians, to describe something as Christian, well, we can use as a basis, what do Christians do? And Christians have done all of those things on that second list that we generated. And I would also say, as somebody who has delved deeply into the world of Christian supremacy and Christian extremism, if you bother to go and study and get to know them, that many of these Christian supremacists and abusers in the name of Christianity are actually quite sincere and deeply knowledgeable about Christianity. I would even hazard that many of the Christian supremacists in this country are more conversant in Christianity than some of the Christians who are in this course. They can quote the Bible more aptly. They know more theology than some of the rest of us. So but how do we deal with that reality? How do we understand that these folks are, by all appearances and rational criteria, Christians? So I'd like to offer a metaphor. Imagine that you come across a gigantic blob just out in the middle of the world, and it's moving in all kinds of directions at once. And you're looking at this thing and trying to understand what's going on. You're trying to figure out what it is. Where did it come from? What is it doing there? And then you hear someone calling from inside the blob. There's someone who lives inside the blob. And they're trying to get the blob to move in a certain direction. They have a desire for the blob to be a certain way. Now, how might your perspective from the outside of the blob be different from the perspective of somebody inside of the blob, right? It's a very, very different view of the blob. It's the same blob, but very, very different experience and view of the blob. And you'd also, I would assume, have different approaches to thinking about the blob, right? If you're on the outside, you're trying to analyze how the blob is changing over time, how it interacts with its surroundings, what are the elements of blobness that make the blob the blob? And if you're on the inside, you have a stake in what blobness is. And you're trying to push the blob in certain directions. You have a goal for the blob, right? And speaking of goals, if you are on the outside, your goal is more or less to understand this blob. Where did it come from? How is it impacting this world that we're in? But if you're on the inside, you have an agenda for how to best direct and move the blob. Now, in my analogy here, the blob is Christianity. And the people on the outside and the people on the inside are basically working with the same data, right? And we call, at least in academia, the people on the outside of the blob, the people who are trying to analyze it from the outside, we call that religious studies. And the people who are inside the blob, we call that theology. These are the terms that we use, just disciplinary terms, to talk about these different approaches to religion, right? Neither of these is better or worse, right? They're just different approaches to the same phenomena, the same reality of Christianity. Well, we have to deal with that reality somehow, right? Now, I want to hold these two lenses, though, in tension as we approach and think about the what's going on within Christianity. And I really want to keep these two lenses in view, especially with regards to this question. And this is the guiding question for our course. How has the Christian tradition reckoned with having political power and resisting political power? Now, if you're coming from a religious studies approach, if you're trying to come at this from outside of Christianity, it doesn't necessarily mean you aren't a Christian, but trying to observe it from this kind of outside perspective, well, then you're going to deal in analysis and comparison and contextualization. That is those are the basic tools of religious studies, right? How has Christianity changed over time? How has the leadership changed? How are the social settings and interpretations changed over time? How is this similar to and different from other religious traditions? What are the cultural and the social and contextual factors that have given rise to these various expressions of Christianity in the world? And if you're coming from a religious studies perspective, Christianity is defined by what professed Christians do or believe, right? It's not something esoteric. It's like, okay, well, what is the data in front of us? How do we understand this thing that we are seeing? Now, if you're coming from a theology side, and again, I want us to think in both of these terms, theology deals in essences and truth claims, right? What was the meaning of Jesus's message and or the Bible, if you might want to separate those out? And how do we get to that meaning? What are the methodologies? What are the approaches that we can take to getting to that meaning in there? You could study scripture. You could learn the tradition, understand all the ways that Christians have thought over the centuries. You could let God guide you in understanding what is right about Christianity. People who are doing theology ask questions like, is this behavior or belief in line with true Christian faith? Religious studies, that's not a question for them. They are not evaluating true Christian faith. They're just looking at what is the data, right? What have Christians done? But if you're inside the tradition, you're thinking in terms of what is the right way to do this? How should Christians faithfully live now in light of the Christian tradition? Again, neither of these is right or a better lens to take with regards to religion. They really depend on your position and your perspective and what you hope to accomplish. So I'm going to offer for us two different theses, two different, one coming from this kind of religious studies approach and one coming from a theology approach. And these are for the entire course, and we'll keep coming back to these. So on the religious studies side, here is my thesis. Religious traditions like Christianity contain multitudes and are multivocal. Okay, religious traditions like Christianity contain multitudes and are multivocal. The same source texts, the same traditions that give rise to and bolster these abusive Christian imperialism and Christian supremacy and Christian racism and Christian colonialism can also provide inspiration to Christian resistance movements and the pursuit of justice and equality within Christianity. Right? That both of those things can exist at the same time and even come from the same texts. Now, on the theology side, I'm actually going to make a case. I'm going to make a normative case about some things within Christianity. I'm going to take some stances as a Christian and make some statements on that. So here's my thesis. Jesus and the early church lived a disempowered, colonized existence. And many in the early church had a radical anti-imperial vision of the equalizing kingdom of God. But as Christians have gained political and cultural power, they have frequently distorted Jesus's teachings. Again, I'm making a normative claim there. They've distorted Jesus's teachings and developed theologies to justify domination, greed, and other behaviors that were antithetical to Jesus's life and message. So again, for those of you who are Christians, you might find these theology claims interesting. You might want to interact with those as theology claims. But for those who are not Christians, I also want to think about this kind of religious studies lens. What is Christianity and how has it developed over the centuries? How has it become what it is today? Okay, so I'm going to focus us around a term called Christendom. Let me define that term for us because it's an important term for the course that the 3 weeks we're going to spend together. So it's a noun. It comes from it's an English noun, right? It's originally an English word. It comes from christen, a word that we use to even how do you name someone? How do you give them a name? It can also be just another word for Christian. And then dom, as in domain, the domain of Christianity, right? Or as in a fiefdom or a kingdom, right? So Christendom, and this is my definition, other people might have different ones, but my definition of Christendom is the geographical realm or set of governing entities that is ruled over by Christian political authorities. And so this week we are going to look at the early Christian church, a pre-Christendom church before Christians had political power, and how it resisted the Roman Empire, how it challenged the assumptions of the Roman Empire. Next week, we will look at the 4th to the 19th centuries. We'll cover 15 centuries in an hour and a half. But thinking about the era of Christendom, where you actually have these kind of Christian governing entities that rule over empires and nations and polities in various regions. And then in the third session, we'll bring it into the present, into the 20th and 21st centuries, and think about, can we ever get post-Christendom? Can we, and what are the theologies of power and resistance that are contemporaneous with us right now? Okay, so that's our agenda roughly, and so hopefully you're kind of oriented to where we're going. Let's dive into it. Let's talk about the early church and its context within the Roman Empire. And it's important to recognize that the early church is growing. It's emerging and growing within this period of the Roman Empire called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome that lasts from roughly the beginning of the reign of Augustus in 27 BCE up through 180 CE of the Christian era, right? So spanning the life of Jesus, spanning the life of the early church is the Pax Romana. Now, we know from history that all empires use force and brutality to maintain and expand their power, but even by the standards of the ancient world, Rome was particularly brutal and violent. The Roman Empire was a slave society, and that phrase is not just accidental, that means something, and I'm drawing especially from the Yale historian David Blight here. We know that as many as 35% of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were enslaved. And this is, I'm going to quote David Blight here because I think it's a very insightful analysis he gives. So he says, all members of the society grew up, were socialized by, married, reared children, worked, invested in, and conceived of the idea of property and honed their most basic habits and values under the influence of a system that said it was just to own people as property. David Blight and other historians estimate that there may be only 5 or 6 slave societies in human history that meet this definition. Ancient Greece and ancient Rome, I believe the Caribbean under European colonialism, Brazil, and the antebellum South in the United States, where you have societies that are structured around slavery, where slavery is a part of daily reality. Now, slavery has been a part of most human civilizations in the past, but we're talking about a society built around the enslavement of people, treating people as property. And in the Roman Empire, if you were a slave, you were treated as an animal or as a household tool. You were not treated as a human being. You were just an instrument to accomplish purposes. The Romans constantly used mass slaughter, crucifixion, and torture to maintain their dominance over all the conquered peoples who were under their quote-unquote peace, right? So part of the experience of living in the Pax Romana was not, oh, hey, we have peace. You're daily seeing people crucified, seeing people tortured, seeing slaves beaten and sometimes killed. That's just daily life. It was common practice in the Roman Empire because men were prioritized over women. Often, if a couple, especially an enslaved or a poor couple, had a female baby, they would take it out into the wilderness and abandon it because they could not provide for it. And so sometimes other people would find those female babies and turn them into slaves. Sometimes wild animals would eat them. And this was just part of daily life. The Pax Romana also entailed a rigidly hierarchical social order that begins with Caesar at the top, who proclaimed that he was God incarnate, through the Roman elites, the top 3% who controlled all the positions of power, down to the paterfamilias, the head of the household, always a man, who generally ran his household as a dictatorship, mirroring the reign of Caesar, down to this roughly 1/3 of the population that was enslaved. That was the social order. And when we think about how the economy worked within this Roman Empire, and I'm getting this especially from this scholar Stephen Friesen, it was a pyramid structure. And the bottom of that pyramid, which included about 90% of the empire, would be considered in the bottom of the pyramid, would be the poor. And that and here we're talking about poor in terms of subsistence, by which we mean, could they get enough calories in a day to maintain their body weight? Right? Could they get enough calories to survive? That is subsistence. And 28%, and these are kind of estimates based on kind of historical and archaeological studies of the Roman Empire. The estimate is about 28% lived at a below subsistence level. They were not getting enough calories to even maintain their body weight. They were literally starving on a daily basis. And that included farm families, unattached widows and orphans, beggars, disabled people, prisoners, unskilled laborers. And then you had about 40% of the empire that lived at a subsistence level. They were just getting enough to survive. And then you had another 22% that was stable near subsistence, right? That just maybe a little bit. And this included merchants, people that we might be tempted to call middle class. They were barely surviving on a daily basis. Now, above that, you have folks who had, and by the way, almost everyone in the early church, in the early Christian church, lived within that 90%. We can name a handful of people who maybe were a little bit above that, but the vast majority of early Christians were in that category of the poor. Now, what they called the wealthy in the Roman Empire were the 7% who lived at moderate surplus resources. Now, when we think in our terms, in our time, moderate surplus resources, we would call that middle class. But in the Roman Empire, that was the wealthy, and they made up maybe 7% of the empire. And this included some merchants and some traders, some artisans, some veterans who maybe had a stipend, right? That they might have a little bit of extra to be able to share with others or share with their family. That's wealth. And then at the very top of the pyramid, you have the super wealthy, the uber wealthy. And the super wealthy included these municipal elites in the cities. Some merchants could even reach up to that level of being in that kind of top 3%. These regional and provincial elites. And then the very, very, very top, you have the imperial elites, the local royalty, the Herods, the Caesars, the Senate, right? The people who could kind of claim power within the society. And there's possible that a few of the characters that show up in the New Testament, maybe Philemon, maybe Cornelius, maybe Lydia and Barnabas, were in that 7% category. As far as we know, none of the characters who participate in the life of the early church belong to the super wealthy. And so when we read in the New Testament about the wealthy, they're talking about that 7% who have just barely a little bit more than enough to get by. So this is a brutal world, and it might not shock you reading and hearing all of this to learn that the life expectancy, the average life expectancy in the Greco-Roman world was 20 to 30 years. Now, a lot of people lived past 20 to 30 years. That number was brought down by the very, very high levels of infant mortality. A lot of people did not live past 5 years, right? And if you live past 5 years, well, maybe you get into the 40s, maybe into your 50s. It was rare that people lived past their 60s. Right? So this is a very difficult existence. And when we talk about religion in the Roman Empire, and here we begin to reach into the problem with Christianity from the Roman perspective. The Romans practiced a fairly flexible and additive form of polytheism that was pretty tolerant, actually. The gods of the people that they conquered and the local gods could join the Roman pantheon and could be accepted in worship in different temples. You could build temples to other gods in the cities. That was all fine. And it was relatively pluralistic, at least in the way that we talk about pluralism, as long as people played by the rules. And the rules said that your civic duty to the polis, to the populace, to the people, and fealty to Rome needs to be demonstrated through participation in rituals, rites, and festivals. Religion was not a private matter in the Roman Empire. It was a public matter. And participation in religion, in the worship of the gods and in these festivals and rituals and rites was seen as part of civic life, as part of civic order. And then what gets introduced pretty quickly in this Pax Romana period is what's called the imperial cult, the worship of Caesar. The idea that Caesar himself is a god incarnate. This was introduced during Jesus' lifetime, and it fully blends civic and religious life, that you would pay your taxes to Caesar, but you would also worship Caesar and bow before Caesar, just like you do the other gods. Now, when Rome encountered religion, they didn't accept any religion. There were certain, what they would call cults, that they did not accept. And the cults that Rome couldn't accommodate tended to be ones that were new, i.e. rootless. The Romans cared about tradition. They cared about the ancientness of ideas. And new cults they did not like. They didn't like anything that smacked of being fresh and innovative. Things that were secretive, that held non-public rites, that was scary to the Romans. If people are doing things in secret, what are they doing? Could that be a threat to civic order? Things that disrupted the social order and the hierarchy. If some of these cults, if you start allowing women or you start allowing slaves to be in leadership, hold on a minute. Suddenly you are disrupting the order of the empire. You're disrupting the Pax Romana, right? And then also any of these cults that rejected the imperial cult, right? The Romans called these cults superstitio, where we get the word superstition. And by what they meant by that was you are disloyal and you are undignified because you are serving foreign deities. You're not part of society. You're antisocial if you are superstitious and part of one of these foreign cults. Now, in that world, Judaism was special. It did not play by the same rules as a lot of these other groups, in part because Jews made up about 10% of the empire's population. They were a very sizable community. Spread all around the Mediterranean world. The diaspora of Judaism was already all over the Mediterranean world in the first century during Jesus' lifetime. And from the Roman perspective, Judaism is an ancient tradition, and that gives it some clout, that gives it some heft, some depth. And Jews were generally exempted from these polis rituals. They didn't have to worship Caesar as long as they prayed for Caesar in their temple and their synagogues. And they were also exempted from military service. But the Romans kept a very wary eye on the Judean, especially Judean and Galilean revolutionaries and these episodic messianic movements that would arise within Judaism, because those, again, were threats to the order. So when it comes to Christianity, the Romans had a real problem. And their main frustration with Christian communities was more what we would call political than it was religious in our contemporary vocabulary. They did not separate out those categories, as we've just seen, right? Politics and religion went perfectly together in the Roman Empire. But from our perspective, in the modern world, their complaints were more about politics than about religion. It was not about what Christians believed. It was about how they behaved and how they operated in society. And if Christians had remained within Judaism, of course, Christianity emerges out of Judaism. Jesus and all of his early followers are Jewish, right? The early Christian church is a Jewish church, right? They probably would have stayed under the tenuous protections, what the early church theologian Tertullian called the religio licita, the licit religion, the acceptable, the legal religion afforded to the Jews. If Christianity remained under the umbrella of Judaism, it probably would have fared a little better in the Roman mind. And if Christians had publicly and even insincerely participated in the imperial cult, they probably would have still been an object of suspicion. The Romans were very suspicious of the Jews, but they would have suffered less persecution. But instead, you have the Christians continuing to offend the Romans. Christians were not like the Jews in that they have their own set of people, and it's kind of an ethnic group. They're converting Gentiles, they're converting pagans away from these civic rituals and away from the imperial cult into a new religion. Right? That is not good from a Roman perspective. That is a problem. That is antisocial. That is disloyal. Christians are also disrupting the social order, especially around the relationship between slaves and masters, but also between men and women. And one of the major Roman complaints centers on the fact that many Christian communities use this terminology of brother and sister to refer to everyone. And so in many of the polemics, these texts that were written to make fun of or to attack Christianity by Roman authors, they would accuse the Christians of incest. So like wives and husbands are calling each other brother and sister. Slaves and master are calling each other brother and sister. And by the way, slaves had no right to their own body. It was a constant experience in the Roman Empire that slaves would be sexually abused and often raped. And so, but here you have master and slave calling each other brother and sister. This just not, it didn't compute from the Roman perspective. And they noticed that Christians are practicing these strange non-public rites like baptism and communion that don't make sense from a Roman perspective, and that is a problem. So if we think about the life of the early church, this is a timeline of the first century roughly. Of course, Jesus is born around the year 0 in the Christian era. Probably was not actually the year 0, probably was 3 or 4 years on either side of it. The Romans weren't very good at calendaring. But Jesus is executed then in the 30s of the Christian era. But throughout the life of Jesus, you had 2 Caesars. One was Augustus Caesar, who reigned from 27 BCE up to 14 in the Christian era. Augustus, by the way, is the grand nephew of Julius Caesar, just if you're kind of thinking in terms of a broader timeline, right? Julius Caesar begins this conversion over from republic into empire. And then it's his grand nephew, Augustus, who gets adopted as his son and his heir, who takes over after Julius. And then Tiberius takes over after Augustus and reigns from 14 to 37. So really, these are the emperors during Jesus's life. And this imperial cult, the practice of worshiping Caesar, gets introduced upon the death of Augustus. That's where this practice of worshiping the Caesars really starts to take hold. It's within the lifetime of Jesus that begins, when Jesus is probably a teenager. And then you have a succession of other Caesars spanning across the first century, from Caligula to Claudius to Nero, and then the year 68, 69 was really tumultuous. You had 3 different Caesars in the space of a year: Galba and Otho and Vitellius. And then Vespasian takes over in the year 69, his son Titus, and then Domitian, Nerva, Trajan, and then ultimately Hadrian is lasting into the 2nd century there. And it is under the reign of Vespasian in the year 70 that this actually begins in the mid-60s. A Jewish rebellion begins in Galilee, led by a group of people that we encounter in the New Testament called the Zealots, a kind of group of Jewish revolutionaries who begin to rebel against Rome, try to overthrow the Roman colonial rule. And it begins in Galilee, in Jesus' homeland, and then it spreads into Judea and ultimately spreads into Jerusalem. The Romans could not tolerate any sort of rebellion within their territories. And so they were brutal in putting down this uprising. And ultimately, in the year 70 CE, under Vespasian's rule, actually under his son Titus as the general, they lay siege to Jerusalem and destroy the Second Temple, the temple in the middle of Jerusalem and on Mount Zion. And that's still the Temple Mount, right? The Wailing Wall today is the last remaining wall of that temple that was destroyed in the year 70 CE. This is the cataclysm, at least within the Jewish and Christian world of the first century, is the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, the New Testament texts are being written from around the year 50, so about maybe 20 years after the death of Jesus, up through the early 2nd century, maybe the year 110 or so. And so for a span of about 60 years, you have the composition of these texts that become the New Testament. So where And when do we know about Christian persecution happening? Where did this Christian kind of impulse or these impulses rub up against the Roman Empire such that they actually got persecuted? Well, some of the sources that we have seem to indicate that it was constant persecution. It probably wasn't constant persecution. It probably was more episodic, more regional, more kind of ad hoc at times from these different rulers. We know in the year somewhere in the 50s, or maybe late 40s, early 50s. It's very hard to find a date on this one because there's only a few sources and none of them date it. But somewhere under the reign of Claudius, we know that the Jews, and that phrase is used, were expelled from Rome. And in fact, it actually says, the Roman historian Suetonius writes about this, and he says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Emperor Claudius expelled them from Rome. And many historians have focused in on this name Chrestus, because it sounds very much like Christ, right? And so many historians have said, oh, this must be as Christianity is spreading into Rome, or as the early church is spreading into Rome, there's this tension between the local Jews and these now Christian Jews, and that must have been the instigating force. We don't know. It could have just been a guy named Christus, right? But this definitely impacts the life of the early church in Rome, and we'll talk about that today. We also know that under Nero, and this is the very famous of the Christian persecutions, right? There's a fire in Rome. This is where, kind of in the legend, right? Nero fiddles while Rome burns, and then Christians become a very convenient set of scapegoats. Again, not because Nero had anything against Christian belief. He probably had very little understanding of Christian belief. They're antisocial and therefore dangerous, and they're an easy set of scapegoats. And so this is where you get kind of the iconic moments of Christian persecution, Christians thrown to the lions in the Colosseum, Christians having to battle in the Colosseum or being slaughtered in the Colosseum, right? It's unclear how long this lasted. It probably started around the year 64, maybe lasted through Nero's reign, maybe continued into this kind of chaotic period where you have multiple Caesars in the same year. And then we know, and we'll look at some of the source text on this as well, under Trajan, in the very end of the first century, beginning of the second century, we know that there was quite a bit of persecution. And it was episodic, but again, the accusation was it was for depraved and excessive superstition. That was the way the Romans talked about this stuff. So I want us to look at a text, and then we'll do another participation activity. So this text it's a piece of correspondence from this guy Pliny the Younger. Well, we call him Pliny the Younger. His name was Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, but we all call him Pliny the Younger for obvious reasons. And the Emperor Trajan, Caesar. So Pliny is he's born in the year 61, so he's kind of living in this kind of generation after Jesus. Life of the early church is kind of expanding. He's the governor of this region called Bithynia Pontus in northern Turkey, modern northern Turkey, or Asia Minor, as it was called in the Roman Empire. And he writes letters to Trajan. They have a correspondence that has survived. And he's corresponding, and he's especially talking about persecuting Christians. This is happening circa 112 CE, so right at the kind of tail end of where the New Testament is being composed. They're writing back and forth about how they're persecuting Christians and how they're dealing with this. Now, Trajan, as you might recall from the last slide, he's reigning from the year 98 to the year 117. And this is what we have in this correspondence between them is one of the best historical sources, at least a non-Christian source, for how the Romans thought about Christians. And so I'll read, and I've edited a little bit because it's a longer letter. But this is Pliny's letter to Trajan, trying to understand how he's supposed to treat these Christians that he's encountering in Asia Minor. So he writes, "It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in the trials of Christians before." So he's kind of confused. He's like, I haven't done this before. I know it's something we're supposed to do, but I've never practiced it, so I want to make sure I'm getting it right. He says, "I have observed the following procedures." In the context here, people have been accused of being Christians. He's trying to investigate to figure out, are they actually Christians? And he says, "I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. and those who persisted I ordered executed. For I had no doubt, whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserve to be punished. He doesn't care what Christians believe. Whatever they believe, they're stubborn, they're obstinate, they're antisocial, they need to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, right? So again, a little bit of a differentiation, right? There's a hierarchy that needs to be respected. Because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome so that you can deal with them, Trajan. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the word gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, to Trajan's image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose together with statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ. And he's trying to kind of say, why I did, well, none of these things which people who are really Christians that have said can be forced to do. If you're really a Christian, you're not going to bow before the gods, you're not going to bow before Caesar, and you're not going to curse Christ. But if you do those things, you'll be discharged. That's evidence enough that you're not one of these Christians. Continuing on at the end of the letter, he says, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing two female slaves who were called deaconesses. You can sense his discombobulation here. They have slaves, female slaves, that they're treating as leaders in their churches. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. For the contagion of this superstition, by which he means Christianity, has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms. That is the way the Romans thought about early Christianity. That's the life of the early church. Again, not all the time, not every Christian was persecuted in the early church, but periodically, this is how Christians are treated by the Romans because they just don't fit the empire. All right, so we're going to go back to Slido, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about this for a minute, and I want you to try to write a sentence. This one is more free form, so you can use more than one word. Try to write a sentence. How was the situation of the early church different from the Christian situation in the United States today? All right, and I'll move over to Slido so you can see these as they pop up. Okay, these are good. They're coming in, so I'm going to start reading some of these just so we can process them together. Early Rome, deeply hierarchical. Today we can transcend hierarchies. Early church persecution focused on behavior instead of belief. There was no constitutional protection. They were a minority. The church was on the outside of society, whereas today it is the empire. The early church did not have power. We have religious liberty, right? Something that we often take for granted. Christians are not persecuted today. Christians are persecuted in some parts of the world. They are not persecuted in the United States. Sometimes people might say some nasty things about Christians. That's not persecution, right? The early church was oppressed. They were minority. They were the underdog. They were not in power. They were under attack and suspicion. Okay, great. So we're gonna go back. All right. So what I want to do in the rest of our time here is think about what we find in the New Testament about this situation? How did the early church process this reality that they were living through? And how does that get encoded in the New Testament itself? Now, I'm gonna go kind of fast here, just to give you a little basic information. This is the traditional outline and ordering and divisions of the New Testament. If you open up a Christian Bible, this is how the New Testament is laid out. It starts with the Gospels, and you have four Gospels. You have a book of history called the Acts of the Apostles that continues on the story after the Gospels, right? The life of the early church, the history of the early church under the leadership of the apostles. You have a set of texts called the Pauline epistles, written by the Apostle Paul. There's 13 of the epistle is just a fancy word for letter. These are letters that Paul is writing to churches or to individuals, and that then get preserved by the early church. Paul is a very, very important figure and theologian in the life of the early church, maybe the most important theologian in Christian history. And then you have, at the end of the New Testament, you have this set, kind of a more random collection of other epistles, other letters that are circulating around the early church: Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, Revelation, or excuse me, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And then at the very end, you have the book of Revelation, the sometimes called the Apocalypse. Apocalypse just means the unveiling. And the book of Revelation is this piece of apocalyptic literature that kind of bookends. It's the very, very end of the New Testament. Now, this is what you'll see when you open your Bible, but more traditional, more contemporary scholarship, the more recent critical scholarship has challenged some of the assumptions about these ones that are here, this way of dividing up and understanding the New Testament. So this is more what contemporary scholars, how they would divide up the New Testament, people who are critical Bible scholars. And they would say, we have a set of texts that we would call actually the synoptic gospels, and seeing the same, and optic, they're seeing the same thing, right? And those are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you go and read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're very, very similar. They're obviously working from a bunch of the same source material. Gospel of John is quite different. It's not one of the synoptic gospels. And they would actually append Acts to the book of Luke, because it's the same author, and Acts is in many ways the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. They actually have the exact same outline and structure if you go and look at them side by side. That whoever this author Luke is, he's smushing together these two stories and really setting them in parallel. And you have what we would call the Johannine literature. Johannine is just a fancy way of saying of John. These are texts that are attributed to somebody named John. Probably not the same John, probably several Johns, or maybe multiple people writing under the title of John. But there's certain themes that continue across these kind of pieces of Johannine literature. And that would include John, the three epistles of John, all very, very short letters, and then the book of Revelation that's attributed to a John. And then we get to Paul. And Paul gets very, very complicated when it comes to contemporary biblical scholarship. There's basically universal scholarly agreement that at least 7 of the Pauline epistles were genuinely written by Paul. And those are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. There are some texts that are disputed, and it's kind of 50-50 on these in terms of the biblical scholars, in terms of whether they were written by Paul or not. Colossians and 2nd Thessalonians, it's kind of on the bubble, and there's a lot of debate, and you can kind of line up the evidence either way in terms of whether those were really written by Paul or by somebody writing in Paul's name. And then we have a set of texts that we would call the pseudepigraphal, another fancy word that just means written by somebody else in the name of someone. The pseudepigraphal Pauline epistles. Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Almost certainly not written by Paul. The style is different. The themes are different. This is a very common practice in the ancient world, to write in the name of somebody famous, often a mentor or somebody that you really looked up to, and as a kind of way of channeling what you understood their teachings to be. This was not a sign of disrespect or of fraud. This is just a common practice in the ancient world to kind of say, this was my teacher, and I'm writing in my teacher's voice. But they're very clearly grammatically different and coming from a different author. And then we have what we would call maybe the more Jewish New Testament literature. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and Revelation. These are texts that seem to be coming from the other side of the major debate in the early church about whether the church is supposed to remain Jewish or not. These are leaders in the early church who are leaning more towards the church remaining within Judaism, or at least remaining connected to Judaism. So that's kind of what we're looking at with the New Testament today. Now, if we come back to our timeline, these texts are being written, and as far as we can tell, there's kind of clusters of them being written at different times. So the genuine Pauline epistles are most likely written around the 50s or early 60s. So you have Galatians, First Thessalonians, maybe Second Thessalonians, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, Philemon, Colossians, and James. The epistle of James is probably also written in this very early period. Now, we know that the Gospel of Mark, which is almost certainly the first of the Gospels, was written right around the year 70, right around the destruction of the Second Temple. And there's markers in the text that are pointing to the destruction of the temple as a contemporaneous event. The pseudepigraphal Pauline epistles are probably written in the early 70s, somewhere in there, maybe a little bit later. And then we know that this other set of texts, the other synoptic gospels, Luke, Acts, and Matthew, Hebrews, Jude, probably coming in the late first century, maybe the 80s, maybe the 90s. And then the Johannine is probably some of the last texts. The Johannine literature is probably some of the last texts that are being written. And these are probably coming in right around the turn of the century. Revelation, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the Gospel of John are coming in pretty late. So here's the main point. If you look at how Christian persecution that we can verify was going on, Christian persecution by the Romans was not uniform or constant, but it shaped the anti-imperial self-conception of the early church. I'll say that again. Christian persecution by the Romans was not uniform or constant, but it shaped the anti-imperial self-conception of the early church. And I'm going to take you in the next 20 minutes or so on a bit of a whirlwind tour of the anti-imperial theme in the New Testament. Across all these different genres of texts in the New Testament, there's an abiding theme of anti-imperial frustration and even polemic against the Roman Empire. Right? Why were the Romans so pissed off at the Christians? You can look at the New Testament and figure it out. So here we go. Let's look at first at Jesus and the Gospels. So I really want to focus on especially on the Gospel of Mark because it's one of the ones where you can see this most clearly. So Mark, whoever Mark is, we don't actually know. It's church tradition that says the author is named Mark. We actually don't, that name is not in the text. But Mark begins the Gospel, first verse, saying the beginning of the good news, euangelion, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I pulled out that word in Greek because it's important. The word that we translate as gospel or good news in English, euangelion, the Greek, means good news. It's a good translation. But this word was in use in the first century. Before Mark or any other Christians picked it up, the word euangelion, the word gospel, was in use by the Caesars. So we know archaeologists have found inscriptions. Here's one from Eastern Turkey, probably published or written or I guess carved around the year 8 BCE, so before Jesus was ever born. And here's what it says. And there's a couple of little gaps because as you can see, just even from the image, parts of it got cut off. Whereas providence, which has regulated our whole existence, has brought our life to the climax of perfection in giving us the Emperor Augustus, whom providence has filled with virtue, literally translated as power, for the welfare of humankind, and who being sent to us and our descendants as our savior, has put an end to war, right? Pax Romana, and set all things in order. And whereas, having become God manifest, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times. And whereas the birthday of the god, as in Augustus, has been for the whole world the beginning of the gospel concerning him, the good news concerning Augustus, therefore let a new era begin from his birth. So in Mark's world, when he begins composing the first gospel, what we call a gospel, he is taking that word from this imperial usage that says the gospel is, congratulations, you've been conquered by a god. The gospel, the good news is you get to live under the Pax Romana. And if you get out of line, you'll be crucified. But good news, right? Congratulations. You are colonized. Embrace it. Good news. And so when Mark comes along and takes up that term, it is not accidental. And in fact, I would argue that the entire Gospel of Mark is a polemic against Caesar and a contrast. There's a perpetual contrast throughout the Gospel of Mark between Jesus and Caesar. And it's common. In fact, the entire Gospel of Mark is structured in what we would call a chiasm, a literary structure from the ancient world that focuses and focuses and focuses on the middle. It's a kind of a parallel structure that builds towards the middle. In the middle of the Gospel of Mark is chapter 8, where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, "Who do the people say that I am?" And the disciples say, "Oh, there's a lot of different rumors about you." And Jesus says, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus says, "God has revealed this to you. Don't tell anyone. It's a secret." Because people keep wanting to conflate Jesus with Caesar. And Jesus has to redefine the entire category in order to not be Caesar. And you get to the very end. In fact, in the Gospel of Mark, the phrase Son of God occurs in verse 1 and does not occur again until chapter 15. When Jesus is crucified, at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, says, this is chapter 15, verse 37, "Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion," this is the commander of the Roman forces who just crucified Jesus, "now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly this man was God's son.'" Note what Mark is doing. Right? It is the agent of empire. It is the brutal enforcer of empire who comes back in the end and echoes the first verse and says, "This is God's real son. This is the real son of a god. Caesar's not a son of a god. This is the real one." Right? Mark builds this arc throughout the gospel. The entire gospel, as I said, is built around this theme. And if you wanted to, I could spend all kinds of time, we don't have that time right now, working through the entire Gospel of Mark and the way that Mark is setting this contrast. Jesus is the anti-Caesar. Jesus lives by a different set of values. The kingdom of God is not the kingdom of Caesar. It's the opposite of the kingdom of Caesar. Caesar is a God who comes, or a quote unquote God, a king who demands that people suffer for him. And Jesus says, "I have come to suffer for you. I am the king who suffers on your behalf. I am the king who sacrifices. I am the king who's a slave and a servant." Right? He flips the kingdom of Caesar and says, that's the kingdom of God. Even in other gospels, if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible, right? Jesus says, "You have heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Now, it was Roman practice, and in fact, it was Roman policy. Within the colonized spaces, Roman soldiers could demand that colonized people, colonized individuals, carry Roman soldiers' equipment for 1 mile. It was actually 1,000 paces. It was a little less than a mile. It was Roman policy. They couldn't ask for more than that on a daily basis. But anytime a Roman soldier could grab any person and say, "You need to carry my equipment for a mile." And Jesus is saying, if they make you do it, go the extra mile. Go another mile. If they hit you, turn the other cheek. If they persecute you, bless them. Right? Jesus is teaching a radical ethic, not of overthrowing Caesar by violence. There are plenty of people talking about overthrowing Caesar by violence around Jesus, but that's Caesar's way. Jesus is saying we overthrow Caesar through self-sacrifice. We overthrow Caesar by caring for our fellow human beings, by treating them in godly ways, by living in defiance of Caesar's claims to power. Right? This is, and you go through the teachings of Jesus. What is the kingdom of God? It's the upside down kingdom. It's being the servant. It's being the slave. If you want to be great, become the servant of all. And absorb into your own self the violence of the state and thereby transform it in an act of love. Right? Very radical concept, a very subversive approach. Right? Jesus is a dissident. He is challenging the way that the Roman Empire is even working. Now, I'm sure somebody in this course of the 170 or so people who are here is thinking, Matt, what about Romans 13? What about Romans 13? This is another very famous passage, often quoted, often infamously quoted. Here you have the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Rome and says some things that seem like he's saying everyone needs to get in line with Caesar. Right? So Paul writing, and I'm going to skip through it a little bit because it's a long passage, right? The authorities that exist have been established by God. And if you do good, you have nothing to fear from the authorities that exist. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. This is also why you pay your taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Very famous moment in the first Trump administration. The Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, cited Romans 13 and said, anyone who is opposing the rule, the leadership of Donald Trump is violating the Bible. Right? It says, whoever's in charge is God's servant. God put them there. But if we read it in context, we see the text in a different light. When is this being written? Right? Almost certainly, Paul is writing this text during Nero's reign, probably early in Nero's reign. And but this is after Claudius has expelled the Jews from Rome. The Jews who follow Christus have been expelled from Rome, seemingly have come back. And if you read the Epistle of Romans, it's trying to work through the relationship between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians in this space. And Paul has never been to Rome at this point. He's never visited this church. He's writing them a letter from a distance. He doesn't know the people there. I think Paul is also cognizant of this letter could be intercepted. This letter could be read. And the church in Rome is in a tenuous position. They were expelled within the last decade and have only just recently been able to come back. This is almost certainly before the fire in Rome, where Nero begins this persecution. So it's this little interregnum where the Jews and apparently Jewish Christians have returned to Rome before Nero begins this mass scale persecution. And so what is Paul counseling? Try to abide by the agreement with Judaism, right? Try to live as an extension of Judaism, not a threat to the empire. Don't present yourself as a threat to the empire, right? Don't just try to live within the situation that you're in, right? I don't think he is saying obey Caesar blindly. He's saying be careful, because we know the bigger rules that are going on here, and watch out. And I think you almost have to. Knowing the actual experience of life in the Roman Empire, you have to read at least part of Romans 13 as tongue-in-cheek. Right? Caesar's only going to be good to people who do good. No, he isn't. That is not how Caesars operate. Right? But if Caesar reads the letter, or if Roman authorities read the letter, okay, these people seem like they're all right. When we look at the rest of the teachings of Paul, you see actually a very radical vision that undermines the social hierarchy. Famously in Galatians 3, the passage in red here, so in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you were baptized into Christ and clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Right? There's an ethic of equality, of egalitarianism in the teachings of Paul. And this is all, I would argue, this is also in the teaching of James and many of the other New Testament authors, saying, hey, we're all part of this community. We're all brothers and sisters, right? And note that that's the language that the Romans get offended by. We're brothers and sisters. And so we don't treat each other with the hierarchy. We don't rank each other. The rich don't get special privileges. We're all together in this. One of my favorite texts from the New Testament, and we've done some work on this in the past, and I can direct you to some of the videos and stuff if you're interested, but this short little letter to Philemon. Philemon is maybe one of these upper class, wealthy participants in the church who owns slaves. He's in Colossae, and Paul writes a letter directly to Philemon because one of his slaves has escaped, a slave named Onesimus. And the slave comes to Paul. The slave, somewhere along the line, has become a Christian. And Paul is sending Onesimus back to his master Philemon. And yet, in the letter itself, even though Paul, right, there's a rigid hierarchy. Paul has no way to say, free this slave. He has no authority to say that. But look at what he says in the letter. Perhaps the reason that Onesimus was separated from you, Philemon, for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He's very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man. Slaves are not men. Slaves are tools. But now he's a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. So if you consider me a partner, again, Paul speaking, if you consider me, Paul, a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done any wrong, he's a runaway slave, right? In Roman society, he has done wrong. Or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me your very self. Talk about a power play, right? Paul is telling Philemon, hey, I understand that you have certain rights in Roman society, and you could execute Onesimus for running away. But he's a brother, and you have to treat him as a brother. And by the way, treat him like you would treat me. And if he owes you anything, I will pay it back. And I'm not even going to mention how much you owe me, right? There is a subtext to Philemon that is coming again out of this egalitarian ethic and saying, we live differently. We don't live by the Roman hierarchy and the Roman logic. So what Paul is doing in his letters is precisely what the Romans are worried about, upsetting the social order and hierarchy through this familial appeal. Philemon is a brother, and you need to treat him as one. What about James? People often will say, well, James and Paul, they really disagree about something. And they did. They really disagreed about some things. But look at what James writes in chapter 5. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corruption will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who is not opposing you. Right? What James is doing, and James is deeply immersed in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets, of the Hebrew Bible. Right? And he's channeling a highly attuned, and I would argue deeply Jewish, ethical critique of the Roman economic system of exploitation. He's saying, we know how this works. We know who the way that the powers The super wealthy treat the rest of us. And James and Paul are both very clear. The rich don't get any special privileges in the church. They get all kinds of privileges out there in society. They don't get special privileges in the church. In fact, they're the ones who come under condemnation. And I would argue this is actually coming directly out of the teachings of Jesus, right? Jesus is very quick to challenge and condemn the rich, even as he embraces and serves the poor, right? Upsetting the hierarchy, upsetting the rigid ways that Roman society is working, right? James is channeling this righteous anger at the economic hierarchy and the violent enforcement of the Pax Romana, and he's anticipating God's judgment on cronyism and on the oligarchy that holds control over Roman society, right? These are fighting words in the Roman Empire. When we get to the end of the New Testament, we come to the book of Revelation. And we're going to spend some time on Revelation, especially in the third week, because this is a text. Revelation is a text that has been widely abused by Christian supremacists. In fact, one of the people that I write about in my book, Lance Wallnau, will frequently say, he's one of Trump's most effective Christian propagandists, will say, Jesus came in the first instance as a gentle savior, but he comes back as a lion. And we need to live with Jesus as the lion. But what is going on in Revelation? What is this text about? The entire text of Revelation is a piece of what we would call apocalyptic literature. This is a genre of literature that existed in the ancient world. And in apocalyptic literature, in this genre, and the challenge for Christian interpreters is we don't have a lot of examples of apocalyptic literature. And so we're kind of interpreting it in a vacuum. There's all kinds of other apocalyptic texts from the first century. They're just Jewish texts, and Christians have not held on to them in the same way. And so we don't have very many things to compare Revelation with. And so we have tended to reinterpret it in every generation. But Revelation, in its context, in the first century or the early second century, is itself participating in this apocalyptic literature, which is a literature of trauma. And a literature of having experienced this imperial abuse, experienced colonization, and then people use this literature to imagine how God's order will wipe away the empires of the world. And that is what is going on in the text of Revelation. The judgment of God is coming on the empires of the world, especially the Roman Empire. That is all these apocalyptic passages that people today tend to read as, oh, this is going to happen in the future. From the perspective of Revelation, yeah, maybe it's happening in the future, but it's not the way distant future. It's the end of the Roman Empire. And just to give you a sense of this, so this is, I pulled out a section of chapter 13, one of the more famous sections of Revelation, the image, the beast, or really there's two beasts, right? But look at how the beast's behavior mimics the Caesars, right? I'm going to move a little quickly here. So the beast, there's these two beasts. They're these kind of apocalyptic figures, very much encoded with all this kind of language. But the beast ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. What is Pliny doing with Trajan? He puts the image of Caesar in with the gods and says, bow here, and then we'll know that you're not a Christian. All who refused to worship the image of the beast were killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Right? What is the Roman complaint about the Christians? They're antisocial. We can't trust them in public. There's certain criteria for participating in public life, which Revelation writes about as the mark of the beast. And then the author says, this calls for wisdom. Pay attention right now. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Now, I grew up evangelical fundamentalist, and I had long, wide-ranging conversations with pastors and friends. What is the mark of the beast? Is it going to be a barcode that people put on you? Oh, we'll know that the one world empire of the apocalypse is coming when somebody tries to put the mark of the beast. And who's the beast? And maybe, I wonder if Bill Clinton is the beast, right? And this is all this speculation. Read the text in its context. What is this number business? Well, in apocalyptic literature, they are often playing with what is called gematria. These are number games around words that was part of Jewish interpretation, and it was continuing part of Jewish interpretation in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in gematria, you assign letter number values to letters, and then you can write coded messages using those number values. And how does it work out? If you take the number 666, well, if you break it down in Hebrew, right? And the Romans don't speak Hebrew, so they don't know how to do this. But the readers know how to do this. And if you break it down, it comes out to Nero Caesar. That's what the mark of the beast is, right? The author is calling our attention and saying, pay attention. Underneath this, I'm sending a message. The beasts are the Caesars. Now, Revelation is probably written well after Nero's dead. So the author seems to be saying Nero, this persecuting, abusing emperor, is the type of all the Caesars. And we just keep repeating the beasts of Rome. And even in some of the most famous passages in Revelation, right? The whore of Babylon, right? This kind of wicked woman who's talked about with misogynistic language at the end of Revelation. Babylon in Revelation is code for Rome. It sits on 7 hills, right? Literally, it's the image of Rome. So even Revelation, this text that is often used and abused today to say Christians need power, is a critique of Roman power and of the Roman Empire. Okay, I'm going to wrap us up. Hopefully we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'm willing to stay after our time to do more Q&A. And if you have questions, please put them in Slido. There's a section in Slido that you can put them in, and that way I can pull them all up together, and you can also vote on other people's questions. Okay, a few final thoughts. First, the early church didn't have it all figured out. And it was messy, and it was argumentative, and it was locked in a very troubled relationship with Judaism. So I am not somebody who's going to come along here and say, we just need to be exactly like the early church. They were the pure church. For my Muslim friends who are participating, I am not a Christian Salafi. I'm not saying that the early church was the pure and pristine church and all the rest was wrong. But the early church saw society from below, across all the different strands of theology and communal formation that we detect within the New Testament, the Johannine community, the Pauline community, the community of the Synoptic Gospels, right? The Jewish voices, the voices that are leaning towards staying in Judaism, the voices that are pulling more towards kind of the Gentile world. All those voices in the New Testament are united in this perspective that we are not privileging the rich and the powerful. And the early church is persecuted because there's a fundamental belief for them that if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar isn't. And if Jesus is Lord, then Trump isn't. And if Jesus is Lord, Constantine isn't. So when we get to Christian imperialism, I would argue that Christian imperialism is a bastardization of the message of Jesus and the life of the early church, because they recognized that to follow Jesus and to follow the way of Jesus, you could not tolerate another Lord. So let me make 2 last points, one theological and one religious studies. So for my fellow Christians, if, and I certainly hope it's not an if, when we resist the rising tide of Christian imperialism and Christian supremacy that we see all around us, I would argue we would do very well to study the New Testament in its colonized context. And I know that I'm a Protestant, but this is a time. The second Trump administration is a time that calls for intensive Bible study, where we recognize just how subversive and just how challenging the early church was to the imperial powers that wanted to claim authority and wanted to abuse other people. And for those of you who are not Christians, who might be coming at this more from a religious studies kind of outsider, like trying to just understand what's going on, please recognize that Christianity is multivocal, just like every other tradition. It contains multitudes, it has plurality built into it. And sometimes one of the best gifts you can give us as outsiders from our tradition, who are looking in the inside, who are looking at the blob from the outside, is holding up the mirror and not letting us get away and say, oh, those people are not real Christians, or oh, that's not real Christianity. Holding up the mirror to say, this is what Christians have actually done. And this is what Christians are actually doing right now. But at the same time, can you recognize and support us in finding the resources and the voices of resistance that are embedded within the tradition? Because I would argue that right now, much of the propaganda around this quasi-messianic cult around Donald Trump is theological. And it's framed within Christian theology. And if we are going to challenge that propaganda, we also need to speak the language of theology. And as Christians, I would argue that it's our duty to do so. Okay, I'm going to take some questions. And I recognize that we are towards the end of our time here. So if you need to take off, if you need to go, you'll get the video of this later. Totally understand. And thank you for joining us. But I'll stick around and try to answer as many questions as I can in the next 15, 20 minutes or so. Okay. Let me pull up. We have we have 70 questions, so we're definitely not going to get to all of them. Let me see here. Let me pull these up and see if I can find them. Okay. Is there a commentary or a book that discusses this contrast between Jesus and Caesar? Yes, there are many. So I would especially recommend there's a series of commentaries on the New Testament written. Most of them are by N.T. Wright. He writes under the name Tom Wright in them. The titles are like, it's the name of whichever book of the New Testament, and then for everyone. So like Mark for everyone, Acts for everyone, Revelation for everyone. And they're very, very accessible. They're short little volumes, but very, very good contemporary Bible scholarship that really help you get underneath to understand some of these contextual clues that are going on. Again, we're so detached from the experience of the early church, and I would argue that much of Christian teaching has forgotten the experience of the early church in our bourgeois comfortability. And so I think getting back to understanding the context is really, really important. Really, I would argue most critical Bible scholarship today is doing this kind of work, is uncovering and contextualizing what is going on in these texts. And by the way, just fantastic resource if you're looking to just buy one thing. You're like, I can only buy one book. Get this book. No, it's not showing up. Let me put it in front of my face. The Jewish Annotated New Testament, 2nd edition. I think you can get it for about $30 on Amazon or bookstore or whatever. This is it's a commentary on the New Testament written entirely by Jewish authors who are engaging this set of texts as a Jewish set of texts. So these are not Christians. These are Jewish authors who are well versed in the contemporary Jewish conversation and are putting these New Testament texts into conversation with other texts being written by Jews at the same time. And it's just a phenomenal resource. I recommend it to all pastors. I recommend it to all lay people. It's a way of approaching the New Testament that I think we desperately need these days. Okay. I'm trying to look at what are the different questions here. Another person asked about resources. Again, Jewish Annotated New Testament and the commentaries for everyone. I would highly recommend. There are also, and we'll talk about this some in the when we get to our third session about some of the contemporary theologies of resistance. There are commentaries that are being written from the perspective of economic justice. There are commentaries that are being written from the perspective of racial justice and coming out of Black theology and post-colonial theology and womanist theology, queer theology. I mean, there's so much scholarship being done on the New Testament, including commentaries that are also thinking about the environment, that are thinking about justice, that are putting this stuff in its original context. There's a wealth of resources out there, and I would highly encourage you. And we'll send out with our follow-up email some of these resources as well, and we'll link to them. Somebody said the lion reference was new to me. Can you provide more on that? And yeah, we can talk about that, especially in the third session. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so what Lance Wallnau is doing when he focuses in on that image is to say, see Jesus as this conquering, devastating lion, and we need to follow him. If you go and read Revelation, throughout, I mean, there's one time that Jesus is referred to that way. Throughout the book of Revelation, Jesus is the lamb. He's a slaughtered lamb. That's the image of Jesus in the book of Revelation, as the one who is continuing to absorb humanity's aggression against God. And that's the paradox of Revelation, is that Jesus is simultaneously king of the universe and the slaughtered lamb, the one who has suffered on our behalf. And to detach Jesus from his suffering, I would argue, is just a totally awful way of approaching the Bible. So somebody asked, how do we consider an opposition to Christian imperialism from a multi-faith perspective? Are there similarities in the Quran and Talmud? Yes. So as I was saying, I think all traditions, all political traditions, but all religious traditions grapple with this question of power and how we use power, how we access power, how we interact with power. Now, it's different in every tradition. In the Islamic tradition, which is where more my expertise is, you have part of the Quran is revealed when the community is in Mecca, when they are disempowered and on the outside and are often kind of victims of persecution. And then part of the Quran is revealed in Medina, when the Prophet Muhammad is kind of guiding the whole community and has political power. And so there are differences, there are variations, and even some of the debates that go on within contemporary Islam about participation in democracy, about interactions with non-Muslims within majority Muslim societies. Those are also what we call hermeneutical and exegetical debates about how do you correlate the experience of power in Medina versus the experience of being without power in Mecca, right? And that those very passages that there's argumentation within the Islamic tradition and within the Jewish tradition. I mean, for most of Jewish history, at least textual Jewish history, Jews have not had political power, and yet we're in a moment since 1948 when there is a Jewish state. And so there's been all kinds of good conversations within Judaism about how do Jews reckon with a moment where there's such a thing as an Israeli army, as there's such a thing as an Israeli government, and how does that interact with people who are not part of the Jewish community, right? And so yeah, this is definitely things that all traditions. I mean, this is going on in Buddhism. This is going on in Hinduism. The power, what we would call politics, is fundamental to the human experience, right? We're all having to deal with power. And so it's something that always comes up in our religious traditions. And I would argue that all of the religious traditions, at least every religious tradition that I've encountered, is multivocal on these questions. And this is why you find debates, right? Another way of putting this is our source texts in the Christian tradition, the Bible, does not solve our problems. It gives rise to our problems. Right? The text itself contains the debate, and we continue the debate. It's not that, oh, I can cite a Bible verse and solve this. No, it's a lot more, it's a lot harder than that. But we have to choose how we read the tradition, how we interact with the tradition. Now, again, that is a theological question. And I think we always have to keep our eyes on the religious studies side too, and say, yes, those the Inquisition, the Crusades, that was Christian. That was what Christians did. And they used Christian theology to justify it. That does not prevent us, though, from inside the tradition critiquing and saying that that was not faithful to the character of Jesus. Christianity is a human tradition. Jesus was not walking around first century Galilee saying, I'm going to found a world religion called Christianity, right? The Christian tradition is a tradition of reflection on the life of Jesus, growing out of the experience of the early church, but it's a human tradition. And so therefore, humanity, with all of its beauty and its foibles, is built in. Okay. So somebody said Trump has weirdly survived so many obstacles confronting him. This energizes the evangelical, charismatic, prophetic groups. How do we respond to them? Great question. I mean, when Trump in his inaugural address cites the assassination attempts and says that God has spared his life so that he can make America great again, I guess I would point to the Psalms. Why do the wicked prosper? Right? The biblical tradition, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, is trying to reckon with this question of like, just because you live a good life, just because you live an honorable life, just because you live a righteous life, does not mean that you will have a good outcome. And this is why all versions of the prosperity gospel bastardize the life of the early church. The early church was not prosperous. The early church did not have it easy. And the early church never claimed that they should. Right? They recognized that they were on the bottom of society, and Jesus even taught them about how to live at the bottom of society, how to embrace being at the bottom of society. And I would argue that the best moments in the Christian tradition, the best expressions of Christianity, have come from the margins of societies. When Christians get power, we have tended to greatly abuse that power. And we'll talk about that next week. But that doesn't mean that is the only option. We can still live faithfully by the way of Jesus from the margins. And increasingly, I would argue, those Christians who want to live by the way of Jesus in our society are going to live from the margins, because the voices that have power right now are the voices of Christian supremacy. Is there a particular Bible translation that's commonly used by MAGA Christian nationalists? Not really. A lot of the more charismatic Pentecostal folks prefer New King James, mostly because it's a little more lyrical, I think. NIV. There is a particular translation that is especially awful called the Passion Translation that isn't even really a translation, it's more like a paraphrase, but and some of the ways that it renders some of these verses are just terrible. So that's fairly popular, but not universal. People, I mean, you can abuse passages in any translation, is how I would phrase it, I guess. Let me see. Maybe a couple last questions. Somebody asked, how are Christians today justifying and excusing Trump's amoral behavior in this context? So I've written several articles about this, and we can send links to those in the follow-up email. Let me just give a quick example, because somebody else raised a question about this. So when it started, when Trump first entered the presidential race in 2015, there were a number of Christian leaders who surrounded him, mostly charismatic, mostly non-denominational. And these are folks who believe in modern day prophecy. And Lance Wallnau, the guy who talks a lot about Jesus being a lion, was in some of these first meetings with Donald Trump. And he claimed that he received a prophecy that Donald Trump was a type of Cyrus. Cyrus was the emperor of the Persian Empire who sent the Jewish people back from exile. And in Isaiah chapter 45, God is speaking about Cyrus through the prophet Isaiah, and God calls Cyrus a Mashiach, an anointed one. This is where we get this, the Hebrew term where we get the term Messiah. And so what Wallnau was saying, and this gets picked up by all kinds of Christians, especially in the 2016 campaign, was to say that Donald Trump is not a godly man, but he's God's man. He's an instrument in the hand of God. And so he doesn't have to be a good Christian because Cyrus wasn't Jewish. He was an instrument in the hand of God. And over time, as that became more and more, that was the line in 2016. And as Christians have accommodated themselves more and more to Trump's immorality, more and more to his abuses, more and more to his mistreatment of other people, especially outsiders, they've embraced other metaphors. And so they'll often say, well, Donald Trump suffered on our behalf like Jesus. He suffered unjust persecution like Jesus. The image that came to dominate these kind of Christian propaganda memes and ideas right before this 2024 election was a comparison between Donald Trump and this obscure biblical king Jehu. Most Christians, a lot of Jews have never heard of Jehu. This is 2 Samuel 9 and 10, I believe. And in, or maybe it's 2 Kings. And in the story of Jehu is this violent figure. I mean, he stages a coup in the nation of Israel and overthrows Ahab and Jezebel, slaughters hundreds of people. And many of the Christian advisors who surrounded Trump would make this comparison between Trump and Jehu and say, Jehu drained the swamp, we want you to drain the swamp. And what they're referring to is massacres. They're referring to, I mean, Jehu slaughters the children of Ahab and Jezebel and piles their children's heads at the city gates. And that's the imagery that Christians were using in the lead up to this election to justify and in many ways to condition their followers and say Donald Trump is going to be violent. And that's just the script he has to follow. That's the Bible he has to follow. So no, these are very, very violent and very toxic theologies. This is not Romans 13 kind of citation where it's just like, oh, he's appointed by God. It's very targeted, and it's very much embracing a vision of violence, of Christians perpetuating or at least justifying violence. It's 8:42. I'm going to wrap it there, but thank you. And I see a number of people have recommended some sources in the text, and we'll try to preserve those and share some of those as well. And thank you for joining us tonight. And please come back next week and we will resume this and look at the dark side of Christianity. Thank you all.